latest installment of the conversation of the UC Davis Humanities Institute, or DHI. Today's event will be on Russia and Ukraine. My name is Jamie Fisher. I'm professor in the departments of German as well as Cinema and Digital Media and the director of the DHI. Before we get started, we take a moment to acknowledge the land on which we are gathered. For thousands of years, this land has been the home of the Putwin people. Today, there are three federally recognized Putwin tribes: the Quechel-Dihi Band of Wintun Indians of the Clusa Indian Community, the Quetzal-Dihi Wintun Nation, and the Yocha-Dihi Wintun Nation. The Putwin people have remained committed to the stewardship of this land over many centuries. It has been cherished and protected as elders have instructed the young through generations. We're honored and grateful to be here today on their traditional lands. Also, before we commence, I would like to offer my heartfelt thanks to Gina Nunes and Kathy Wallerstein for their help in making today's event possible, as well as to Professor Sally McKee and the History Club for helping to organize today's event, as well as the History Project at UC Davis and the California History and Social Science Project for preparing relevant materials for the teaching of some of these topics. We'll be posting the links that they've prepared for material that's relevant to today's issues and topics. So, the UC Davis Humanities Institute is a leading voice on our campus for the essential value of arts and humanities. Part of our mission is to underscore how the humanities and arts can, and we think should, contribute to debates, controversies, and epic-making events like the one we'll discuss today in our broader society. Today's topic is on Russia and Ukraine, certainly about the ongoing invasion of Ukraine by Russian forces, but also about the context for these shocking developments. As we will hear, there's important history here, but also a disturbing break in the post-1989 order that we have to face and discuss. Toward that end, we've assembled 5 experts to discuss this complex history, as well as the multifaceted war. Our format today will be that we will hear short presentations by our 5 participants. I shall introduce each briefly, and we shall hear their presentations. Some have slides, and then we'll have an open discussion afterward, after all 5, in the spirit of our conversation series. Please use, if you would, the Q&A function of the webinar to enter your questions. We will do our best to get to all of them before we conclude at 5:30. Okay, so we're going to start. We're going in the order that was announced, which happens to be alphabetical. So our first presenter is Jo Andrews, who is associate professor in the Department of Political Science. Her research focuses on processes of transition and democratization in Central and Eastern Europe, ongoing research projects on cabinet instability, populism, and polarization in Central and Eastern Europe. Earlier research on related topics include the book When Majorities Fail, the Russian Legislature, 1990 to 1993, Institutionalizing Parliament in Central and Eastern Europe, and the Routledge Handbook of Eastern European Politics from 2017, and Institutions and the Stabilization of Party Systems and New Democracies of Central and Eastern Europe, co-authored with Richard Barrett. Her presentation for us today is entitled, Why Now? Relevance of Domestic and Regional Politics and Understanding Putin's Aggression Towards Ukraine. And we will make sure she can join, share her screen. You want to go ahead and try? Yeah.
How's that?
Yep, we can see it. So if you want to hit presenter view or slideshow.
Okay, great. So shall I begin?
Please do, go ahead.
Okay, thank you all so much for inviting me to contribute to this forum on a very timely and important events. So the interest of time, I'm going to stick very closely to my text. So what I'm going to try to do is bring some political science perspective to this. And so I'm going to especially emphasize recent domestic and political developments in both Ukraine and Russia that I believe are contributing to this, answering this question of why now. So Putin has stated 2 primary reasons for Russia's military invasion of Ukraine. Number 1, the eastward expansion of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO, and alleged US-NATO aggression towards Russia. So the expansion, of course, occurred after the end of the Cold War, starting in 1990. And 2, the threat to ethnic Russian speakers living in eastern Ukraine, especially in the Donbass region. So let me start with NATO expansion. So, of course, certainly NATO has expanded. It's increased from 16 member countries in 1990 to 30 member countries today. And importantly, however, 9 of the 14 countries that have joined NATO since 1990 have been former communist countries that were either republics of the Soviet Union, such as Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, the Baltics, or satellite states, which were brought under the influence of the Soviet Union after World War II. So for example, countries like Poland and Hungary. Thus, most of the countries that have joined NATO since the end of Cold War used to be part of Russia's sphere of influence. So President Yeltsin in the 1990s and President Putin since 2000, his first election in 2000, have both opposed NATO expansion. However, in the 1990s, Russia was economically and politically weak and was forced to acquiesce in both NATO and EU expansion. Even in the early years of the Putin presidency, which began in 2000, the domestic concerns were of overriding importance. At that point in time, in the early 2000s, Russia was just beginning to recover from a devastating 10-year economic depression. So mostly driven by Putin's renationalization of Russia's oil and gas companies, and of course, rising energy prices in the early 2000s propelled Russia's extraordinary economic recovery. The period of high growth reached its peak in 2008, the year that Putin won a second term, Putin stepped down and Medvedev served as his sort of his protege and interim president. At that point, Putin had served 2 terms. So by 2008, standards of living in Russia had improved dramatically. So by 2008, Putin was extremely and truly popular, with consistently high public approval ratings of over 80%, despite agency carrying out these approval rating surveys. Just as a comparison, Biden's approval rating today is 41%. So at this point in time, Putin, acting at this point as prime minister, but nonetheless, certainly the power behind the throne in Russia during the 2008 to 2012 Medvedev presidency, Putin then was able to begin to focus on other issues, namely the restoration of Russia's place of importance on the world stage, a goal that he had articulated in the very beginning of his 2000 presidential term. So in 2008, Russia began a major modernization of its military. And in 2015, Russia intervened in Syria's civil war, and in so doing enabled Russia's ally, the al-Assad regime, to defeat US-supported opposition forces and secure al-Assad's position. Since then, President Putin's opposition to NATO expansion, past, present, and future, has grown in stridency and urgency. Consider, however, that the most recent countries to join NATO have been Albania and Croatia in 2009, Montenegro in 2017, and North Macedonia in 2020. So although they are former communist countries, none of these countries were part of the Soviet sphere of influence. They were instead republics of Yugoslavia or its tiny neighbor, Albania. So during the Cold War, Yugoslavia was not a Soviet ally, nor was it a member of the Warsaw Pact. So the last countries that had been part of the USSR, that is as republics or among its satellites, to join NATO did so in 2004, 18 years ago. So in the weeks leading up to the invasion of Ukraine, Putin demanded NATO must guarantee that it will not expand to include any additional former East European countries, or East European countries, I should say, former communist East European countries. NATO must guarantee that Ukraine will never join, and NATO must remove troops and materiel from new East European NATO members such as Poland and Lithuania. However, if the US and NATO were to meet these demands, this would mean that NATO had fundamentally changed. Under such circumstances, NATO could no longer claim to offer mutual defense of all member states, since members such as Poland would consider the removal of troops and defensive weaponry as abandonment of NATO commitments. Thus, I find it hard to believe that Putin actually expected that NATO would meet these demands. So although Putin has spoken against NATO expansion many times since his 2000 election, he has not until very recently made such strident and urgent public demands. So my one possible conclusion is that although Putin's frustration and objection to NATO expansion is not new, it's therefore hard, however, to attribute Russia's invasion of Ukraine at this moment in time to NATO expansion, despite his assertions to the contrary. So Putin's second stated reason for the invasion of Ukraine has been protection of ethnic Russians living in Ukraine. So the proportion of ethnic Russians living in Ukraine is about 17 to 20%, and a large proportion of these native Russian speakers live in the eastern regions of Ukraine. It's also worth pointing out that even larger proportions of ethnic Russians live in Latvia and Estonia, 2 former Soviet republics like Ukraine that are now part of NATO and the European Union. So protection of ethnic Russians was an important justification for Russia's annexation of Crimea and for providing military support to the separatist insurgencies in Ukraine's eastern regions starting in 2014. And it was the main justification for Russia's continued support for the separatist insurgencies up to the current day. Interestingly, continued conflict between separatists in Donetsk and Luhansk has meant that Ukraine has not held undisputed control over its external borders since 2014. This means that so long as these borders remain disputed, Ukraine cannot join NATO. So in this regard, Russia seemed in 2014 to have already secured both of its stated goals: to prevent Ukraine from joining NATO and protection of native Russians in these two eastern regions of Ukraine. So this situation remained essentially unchanged from 2014 until several months ago, or basically about a year ago, when Russia began significant troop buildups along the southern and eastern borders of Ukraine. And so that brings me to the question of why now? So Putin has said publicly that Russia's invasion of Ukraine is to halt American and NATO aggression, but there have been no acts of aggression that he can point to since 2014. Thus, he seems to be speaking more of the generalized aggression inherent in NATO expansion. Yet NATO expansion has been ongoing for 2 decades, and as I mentioned, no former Soviet republic or satellite state has joined since 2004. Furthermore, there have been no domestic incidents in Ukraine that suggest wide-scale and increasing threats to Russian speakers, and the most ethnically Russian regions continue to be held by Russian-backed insurgencies. But on the other hand, domestic developments in both Ukraine and Russia may shed light on the timing of Russia's invasion. So let me look at domestic changes in Ukrainian politics. So since 2014, public opinion in Ukraine has become increasingly supportive of deeper integration with Europe and membership in the European Union. Overall support has increased from about 40% in 2013 to just over 50% in 2019. And not surprisingly, these numbers have jumped to over 70, almost 80% over the past year. In 2010, public in Ukraine was divided. Public opinion in Ukraine was divided on Ukraine's most important economic and political partners. Should it be Russia, at that time Ukraine's most important trading partner and a country with hundreds of years of shared culture, history, and political experience, or should it be Europe? In 2010, a majority of Ukrainians voted for the pro-Russia president, Yanukovych. However, following the 2014 annexation of Crimea and beginning of civil war, Ukrainian public opinion began to shift. Since 2014, Russia's actions have increased support for EU membership and NATO membership among the Ukrainian population and among Ukraine's political leadership. So you can see that over the past 2 years, the support for EU and NATO membership has increased very significantly. Okay, so in addition, take a look at the 2019 parliamentary elections. So from winning less than half of Ukraine's parliamentary districts in 2012, Ukraine's pro-European parties or pro-EU oriented parties now control a sizable parliamentary majority. Thus, since 2014, Ukrainians have become significantly less supportive of deeper political and economic relationships with Russia and are increasingly tying their hopes to Europe. So now let's look at domestic changes in Russian politics. So in Russia, following the 2018 presidential election in which Putin was reelected with 77.5% of the vote, repression of political opposition has increased significantly. So crackdown on protesters has become increasingly harsh. Police presence at protests, even very small protests, has been quite large and aggressive. And of course, most sensationally, President Putin or those very close to him ordered opposition figure Alexei Navalny poisoned by use of a radioactive element in 2020. After being treated in Berlin, Navalny returned to Moscow, upon which he was arrested and sentenced to 3 years in prison. He's currently facing a 15-year extension to his prison term. Most importantly, however, have been the constitutional changes that were carried out in 2020. So in 2020, the Russian constitution was amended to allow Putin to serve an additional 2 times as president. So Putin is currently serving his 4th term, which will end in March of 2024. At that point, Putin can run again for 2 more 6-year terms, meaning that he could serve as Russia's president until 2036. And power has become increasingly concentrated in the office of the president. And a number of experts have noted that this increased significantly after the 2018 presidential election. So today, Putin has less to fear with regard to public reactions in Russia to the invasion that he would have had prior to 2018. So why now? So I think one possibility is that a confluence of domestic developments in Ukraine and in Russia, coupled with Putin's and his advisors' growing belief that the West is weak. So they focus on the United States, internally divided and weakened because of these internal divisions. Their conclusion is that the US lacks resolve to prevent Russian expansion, and also on the European Union, which is divided by member countries' varying degrees of reliance on deliveries of Russian natural gas. So belief in NATO members' domestic constraints, coupled with Ukraine's turn toward Europe and Putin's significantly tightened domestic control, have likely been an important part of the catalyst for the invasion. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Joe. Our next presenter is Professor David Biale, who is the Emanuel Ringelblum Distinguished Professor of History and the author or editor of 12 books. His presentation for us today is entitled, "Are the Lights Going Out All Over Europe?"
Thank you very much for having me. In August of 1914, just as World War I broke out, the British Foreign Secretary Edward Grey remarked to a friend, "The lights are going out all over Europe. I don't believe that I will see them lit again in my lifetime." Now, Grey was both right and wrong, but his iconic remark made me think about viewing the Russian invasion of Ukraine in long historical perspective. What we are witnessing today is that history has not ended. We are now in yet another wave of the 100-year-long cyclical struggle between the light of democracy and the darkness of autocracy. 4 years after the onslaught of the Great War, the lights did go back on in Europe. 3 monarchs were deposed, 2 empires shattered, and a number of European countries, Germany, Austria, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, and Poland, were now democracies. However, these democracies were subjected to successive hammer blows as Europe between the wars turned increasingly authoritarian. Fascism took hold in Mussolini's Italy in 1922, Hitler's Germany in 1933, and Franco's Spain in 1939. Many Eastern European countries such as Hungary, Poland, and Romania took inspiration from these countries and became themselves quasi-fascist. And of course, in Russia, the Bolsheviks trampled Russia's nascent democracy and constructed a totalitarian regime to rival that of the Nazis. On the eve of World War II, democratic countries were besieged and only survived Hitler's empire with the assistance of Stalin's division. Then, too, the lights went out and only came on after the war in the democratic West. In Eastern Europe, the Soviet Empire turned off the electricity. The half-century after World War II saw the world divided, seemingly permanently, by what Winston Churchill termed an Iron Curtain. And then, in 1989, the lights came back on. The Soviet Empire disintegrated, and newly independent states, including former Soviet republics and Eastern European countries, embraced democracy and the capitalist system of the West. But the forces of darkness had not been vanquished. Russia's democratic experiment was dismantled by Vladimir Putin starting 2 decades ago. Other European countries like Hungary and Poland more recently found refuge in ethno-nationalism and suppressed civil liberties. With the election of Donald Trump in 2016, it seemed that the lights of democracy, if not extinguished, were flickering badly. Even before the Russian invasion of Ukraine, it was evident that Putin wanted to resurrect the Soviet sphere of influence, itself the inheritor of the vast empire of Imperial Russia. And this new empire represented not only the conquest of land, but also of democracy. Putin has worked assiduously to support anti-democratic forces throughout the world, and especially on the European continent. No wonder that he considered Donald Trump a useful idiot, since Trump's sycophantic worship of Putin, even after the invasion of Ukraine, was but one more symptom of the turn away from democracy by one of America's 2 great political parties. They are like the America First lobby in the late 1930s, led by Charles Lindbergh, that sided with the Nazis. Like then, Putin does not merely want to recreate the Soviet Empire, but actually to go further, to make the world safe for autocracy. If the great turning points in history of the last 100 years were World War I, World War II, the post-war order, and then the revolutions of 1989 and after, we are now on the cusp of a new turning point in which the forces that have been arrayed against each other since Edward Grey made his pronouncement remain locked in battle. Democracy has never been under greater threat than when Hitler invaded Western Europe in May 1940. At that time, the democratic world appeared flabby, fractured, and dysfunctional in the face of fascism. But democracy ultimately prevailed. Will it now, when it appears just as flabby sometimes, fractured and dysfunctional? It may seem hyperbolic to say that we stand on the eve of World War III. By this, I don't have in mind Pearl Harbor, the Battle of Stalingrad, or the Normandy invasion. Neither do I have in mind nuclear war, despite Putin's rather desperate order to put Russia's nuclear weapons on alert. Nuclear weapons, after all, turn a country into a muscle-bound giant, since such weapons can't actually be used. What I mean instead is that the invasion of Ukraine has already mobilized the democratic West and beyond. Sanctions, arms for the Ukrainian resistance, boycotts by soccer clubs. Much of the world is now engaged in unprecedented economic and financial warfare against Russia. All of this means that the war has already spilled beyond the borders of Ukraine and become global. As the Ukrainians mount an insurgency against the Russian army, there's little doubt that Putin will increasingly blame the West and will take his revenge. He threatens now to do to the Ukrainian cities what the Nazis did to Warsaw. In the words of the Roman historian Tacitus, to make a desert and call it peace. For now, energy continues to flow from Russia to Western Europe, but I wouldn't count on that continuing. For now, there doesn't appear to be any significant cyber warfare between Russia and the West, but I wouldn't count on that continuing either. Ukraine has called for cyber hackers around the world to attack Russia. It may be very hard to distinguish between such patriotic hackers and government cyber warriors. Even if energy continues to flow, cyber warfare can destroy electrical grids and water supplies. I have no doubt that Putin will use all of these weapons if he feels himself cornered. And if that happens, then the lights may be literally going out all over Europe, if not also on our own shores. And so, to conclude, we are all Ukrainians now.
Thank you, David. Just a reminder that if you want to ask a question, you can post it in the Q&A function. We ask that you do it there because the chat's going to fill up. We have quite a few participants today, which is great. I think shows the interest in this important topic, but the Q&A function makes it a lot easier for our panelists to look at the questions and answer them. So our next presenter is Professor Ian Campbell, who is Associate Professor in the History Department, where he currently serves as Director of Graduate Studies. He is a historian of the Russian Empire, with a particular interest in the relationship between non-Russian peoples and territories in the imperial core. His first book, entitled Knowledge and the Ends of Empire, Kazakh Intermediaries and the Russian Rule on the Steppe, 1731 to 1917, was a finalist for the Central Eurasian Studies Society's Book Prize in History in the Humanities and was published in Russian translation just last month. His presentation for us today is entitled Beyond the Little Green Men, Understanding Russian Aggression in Crimea and the Donbass.
All right, thank you all for having me. Let's see if after 2 years of Zoom, I can get the screen share right.
Looks good.
All right. So the temptation as a historian, when you get invited to do a talk like this, is to say all of this goes back as far back as we can possibly make it go, right? We need to have a whole millennium to understand Russian aggression in Crimea and the Donbass. I'm going to try to resist that temptation today. I'm going to begin my discussion in this short talk on Russian aggression in Crimea and the Donbass in November 2013. With the Euromaidan protests in Ukraine. This was a series of protests that began on Kyiv's Independence Square, sparked by a decision by Ukrainian President Viktor Yanukovych, to reverse course and refuse to sign an association agreement with the European Union. Yanukovych took this decision under strong pressure from the Russian government, which was prepared to offer him significant financial support to not sign it. In the absence of such financial support, a financial crisis loomed, which would have been harmful both for Ukraine as a whole and for Yanukovych's electoral prospects personally. By early December 2013, Euromaidan had more than 500,000 protesters around Ukraine. By February 2014, in the midst of serious violence by both the Ukrainian state and by Euromaidan protesters, in which latter a small group of right-wing nationalists played a regrettably outsized role, protesters rejected an agreement to resolve the Euromaidan crisis. Yanukovych fled, and Ukrainian parliament acted extra-constitutionally to remove him from power and install a new government. The removal of Yanukovych in this context was a deeply worrisome sign for Putin in two respects. It was an example close to home of a leader being removed from power by a popular movement. It made it clear that the new Ukrainian leadership would have a strong mandate to pursue closer integration with Europe. And it meant that these two concerns, democratization and Ukraine drifting out of the Russian orbit, seemed to be intimately connected with one another. The linkage of these two factors is vital context for understanding the aggressive Russian behavior that followed in the rest of 2014. This behavior focused on two areas, the Crimean Peninsula and the Donetsk Basin, usually just called the Donbass of southeastern Ukraine. That's Donetsk and Luhansk provinces that you're going to see on the right there. Intervening in these regions promised to hamstring the new Ukrainian government, weaken democratic movements, and in the Crimean case, to annex some strategically useful territory to Russia. The outcomes in these regions were different: annexation to Russia for Crimea, until quite recently, low-level warfare and quasi-independence for the Donbass republics. Yet the starting conditions were strikingly similar in some respects. Both regions had been parts of the multi-ethnic Russian Empire. Note that being part of the multi-ethnic Russian Empire is very different from having been part of the ethnic Russian nation. After the October Revolution, these were the two most heavily Sovietized regions of Ukraine, meaning people there had relatively strong identification with the Russian language, regardless of their ethnicity. These were both areas where there was some extant support for closer ties with Russia and separation from Ukraine, even prior to Euromaidan, on the order of a quarter or a third of the population. Both of these areas had served as power bases for Yanukovych's ruling party, the Party of Regions, and this placed political elites in Donbass and Crimea both in an awkward spot after Yanukovych was out of power. So in short, looking at Ukraine from outside after Euromaidan, Crimea and Donbass were the most obvious levers to push on to destabilize the situation. And I'll talk about the particularities of both of these cases in turn now. Crimea is a place with huge political and cultural resonance for Russia. Its major city, Sevastopol, was a hero city of the Soviet Union for its role in World War II. Crimean beach towns were and remain popular destinations for Russian tourists. Under Soviet rule, Crimea initially had the status of an autonomous republic within the Russian Soviet Republic. After Stalin's deportation of the Crimean Tatars during World War II changed the demographics of Crimea, it became no longer autonomous, but simply an oblast, a region of the Russian Republic. In 1954, Nikita Khrushchev transferred it to the Ukrainian Republic. After 1991, Crimea's place in independent Ukraine was not a very happy one. Little effort was made from Kyiv to increase the standard of living there, and the halting efforts that existed accomplished not all that much. Crimea also had a bare majority of ethnic Russians and a substantially Russophone population. Still, these concerns did not result in majority support for separation from Ukraine until Euromaidan. After Euromaidan, Russian propaganda exaggerated the role of nationalists in the Maidan movement, and more people in Crimea began to believe that Russians in Ukraine faced a life or death struggle, a feeling that some local politicians, now without a patron in Yanukovych, sought to make use of. An anti-Ukraine rally in Sevastopol drew 20,000 people at the end of February 2014. Several days later, armed men captured Crimean parliament, which at gunpoint approved a referendum on secession from Ukraine. Russian forces, the infamous Little Green Men, also sometimes referred to as the polite people, this is all a euphemism for Russian armed forces, moved in to isolate Crimea from mainland Ukraine and blockade Ukrainian units. In this context, the referendum on independence passed in March 2014 with a very unlikely 96.8% of the vote. Admission to the Russian Federation followed shortly thereafter. It would be difficult to overstate the positive political effects of annexing Crimea for Putin, as you can see from the Levada Center jump. Look at this data here. Look at this huge jump in March 2014. Only eventually did it become clear to Putin's team why this had worked so well. He offered a variety of justifications initially, and only eventually did it turn out that his rhetoric on protecting Russian speakers and the return of historically Russian territory were what resonated. The case of Donbass, though, is a little different. Donbass, although it was also heavily Sovietized, had less cultural resonance in the Russian Federation. This had always been a multi-ethnic region, and by contrast with Crimea, retained that diversity in Soviet times. The predominance of the Russian language here had to do with the predominance of heavy industry and heavy Soviet influence here. Donbass, even now, remains majority Russophone, but not majority Russian. It had been the main power base of Yanukovych and his party of regions, as you see from the electoral results here. Yanukovych used the issue of protecting Russian culture against incursions from Kyiv strategically to shore up his electoral support in the Donbass. Despite this rhetoric, prior to Euromaidan, here too, as in Crimea, there was not a majority of support for separation from Ukraine. When Yanukovych left power, the remaining members of the Party of Regions in Donbass attempted to make use of the small radical movement for independence from Ukraine that did exist in negotiations with Kyiv, encouraging the activities of this independence movement. This was a bargaining chip to try to get better terms from Kyiv, and it was something that they thought they could control. And in this, they turned out to be extremely wrong. Russian propaganda and some missteps from the new Ukrainian government helped this independence movement to grow. The annexation of Crimea in March 2014 appeared to independence activists to present new possibilities for them. In this way, the remaining Party of Regions personnel lost control of the situation, with radicals forming armed militias. In April, these militias would proclaim new people's republics in the cities of Kharkiv, Donetsk, and Luhansk. Ukrainian authorities reasserted control only in the first of these, in Kharkiv. In the latter two places, Donetsk and Luhansk, snap referenda were proclaimed under the watchful eye of armed militiamen, both of which, unsurprisingly, ended up favoring independence. And you can see here the Donetsk and Luhansk territory after the referendum. The new Ukrainian government's anti-terrorist operation, as it was called, against these insurgent groups, began poorly as a result of years of neglect of the Ukrainian army. Their opponents in the Donbass were a blend of local separatists and Russian volunteers, backed as events developed, particularly as the Ukrainian army started to perform a little better, backed by Russian cash, war material, and personnel. There are credible accounts of atrocities committed by both sides over the course of 2014, most notoriously the accidental downing of a Malaysian Airlines flight by the pro-Russian insurgents in July of that year. An initial ceasefire agreement that was arrived to at Minsk in September 2014 was completely ignored. A second ceasefire arrangement negotiated in February 2015, colloquially called Minsk II, had been in force until recently. Minsk II, as a ceasefire, was not so effective in that it did not actually cause fire to cease, but it did reduce fighting significantly and was meant to provide a framework to resolve the conflict later. Minsk II was hammered out under military circumstances advantageous to Russia, so its provisions are a good guide to what Putin was, at least at the time, hoping to get out of the Donbass. This was mainly greater autonomy for the Donbass within Ukraine and a stable border with Russia. But Minsk II was, as one political scientist puts it, an agreement that could not be implemented, but also could not be abandoned. On the Russian side of things, outright annexing the Donbass had too many costs, whereas maintaining low-level conflict meant that there was always a place to increase or decrease pressure on the Ukrainian government as circumstances might have required. On the Ukrainian side, Minsk II would have required constitutional amendments in Ukraine that would never have passed. But Ukraine aggressively reasserting control in the Donbass would have necessitated provoking a real war with Russia. And so the situation had been ambiguous from 2015 until, well, about a week ago. And while that ambiguity meant a miserable reality on the ground in the Donbass, with more than 10,000 dead and more than 1 million internally displaced persons, it was a cost that both states seemed able to bear because it seemed preferable to any of their alternatives. But something has clearly changed now. And I'm going to close with 3 hypotheses about what that something might be in increasing order of plausibility, as it seems to me. Putin might be hoping for a similar bump in popularity to what he had after Crimea from a short victorious war that could play by stretching the truth on some similar themes. That is, say, not only that people wouldn't stop him from doing that, he might have hoped that people affirmatively wanted this. A second hypothesis is that Putin may simply have been trying to turn the heat up on the Ukrainian government and make it friendlier to Russia, but instead found himself trapped by the image of himself he's fashioned over the past 2 decades. A tough, macho leader at the head of a resurgent Russia that must be taken seriously. Putin may, in other words, have trapped himself into carrying out a threat he might not have wanted to. The third possibility, and this is the scariest one, is that at some point over the past 6 or 7 years, Putin has come to actually believe the things he says about Ukraine, about reclaiming what he calls ancient Russian lands. This was clearly instrumental political rhetoric at the time Crimea was annexed. If Putin believes it to be true now, it is very hard to see how this war will end.
Okay, thank you, Ian. Just a reminder, you can put your questions in the Q&A function. We already have 20 plus, so if you don't mind, it would be helpful if you read through the questions and avoid asking redundant questions. I don't think we'll get through 23, so you'll have to excuse our staff, and we apologize in advance if we don't get to your question. Also, a reminder is that there's a link at the top of the chat for teaching materials related to today's topic. So our next presenter is Anya. She is a PhD candidate in history and human rights at UC Davis. Her scholarship focuses on something very relevant for our current events: the politics of the memory of World War II in the USSR and the Soviet Union in late Stalinism. Her presentation for us today is entitled "Putin's War Propaganda Machine: From Genocide in the Donbass to the Gang of Drug Addicts and Neo-Nazis," in quotes, in Kyiv.
Thank you for having me. Does my presentation look normal?
Yes, looks good.
Okay, thank you. Well, first of all, I just wanted to say that it's a very personal catastrophe for me. I'm from Russia. I have family and friends in Ukraine, and it's just it's a literal catastrophe. Yesterday, according to the United Nations, they counted that at least 230 civilians died already, including 15 children. And I do believe that the propagandists who are working for the Putin's regime are as guilty as him and his generals in these deaths. So first, I'm going to briefly talk very briefly about the general structure of the massive propaganda machine built by the Russian state.
Oh, Anya, if you can, I think we're seeing presenter view, so we could see like if you had notes. So maybe hit the slideshow button. There you go.
So Dr. Kaminer is going to talk about Putin's efforts to kill independent media. I'm just going to mention that many majority TV channels, radio, and press are in one way or another under the control of the state. Many people in Russia, especially less educated and older people, do get their news from the TV, and you can look at, I just put a couple of these people who are the most notorious. My favorite is the guy in the middle, Dmitry Kisilov, who quite regularly threatens to nuke United States to turn it into the radioactive dust. Of course, propaganda uses other channels, especially the social media. So those Russian bots that everyone heard about in connection with the American election, they are first and foremost used domestically. That's an actual large company. Right now, the company itself is under sanctions, as well as its owner and his whole family. It's an oligarch connected with Putin. This is a large office building, their headquarters in my hometown of St. Petersburg. They have hundreds of employees who get paid salaries to be trolls online, and they post all sorts of stuff, whatever the state needs at that point to kind of skew the public opinion. Additionally, government also uses popular bloggers to distribute certain things, and the same goes with some celebrities who have Instagram accounts, Twitter accounts. They, time to time, when the occasion requires it, usually it's around the elections or something like that, they get sent certain, materials that they basically talk about in their blogs. And it's very effective because, first of all, it targets younger population, and second of all, people trust, they are called influencers, so people do trust them, some people more than TV. Okay, so now I will talk about specific messages that the propaganda is translating right now. So the first is and how does it justify the invasion? So the first justification is humanitarian. So what Ian said, there has been multiple atrocities on both sides during the conflict in the Donbass since 2014. And basically what Russian propaganda does is it puts all the blame for all of these atrocities onto the Ukrainians. And they explain it as if Ukrainian state and ethnic Ukrainians have this Nazi level hatred towards the ethnically Russian people who inhabit the Donbass. As you can see, this is a chart that shows that the mentions of genocide have been, inflated on the Russian television channels since about the middle of January, and right before the invasion, it's been like super high. They also use, in connection with this whole genocide thing, they use a lot of fakes because there hasn't been actual active warfare since 2015. So This winter and in the past year, there have been provocations and even fakes. You can see one of the examples, basically the state affiliated channels issued this report that Ukrainians, shelled and hit this car and people died, civilians. And this independent researchers confirmed that, and it was fake. Okay, so where does the neo-Nazi part come from? So they are saying that Ukrainians hate Russians and they're Nazis. Majority of it comes from, they use this notorious Azov battalion, which is actually a right-wing extremist and neo-Nazi paramilitary group of the National Guard of Ukraine. And it's not Russian word, that's what actually United States Congress defined them. There are actually, right-wing groups in Ukraine, but what Russian propaganda does, it just inflates their importance, and it says that it's actually these Nazi groups that control the state, and like Zelensky, who they call drug addict, I'm not sure where it comes from, they say that he's controlled by these groups, and he's also controlled by the United States. So this is just another example of just completely like off the rail rhetoric that Maria Zakharova, which is the talking head of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, said. Deliveries of the German weapons to the ideological successors of the Nazi collaborator Stepan Bandera make you think, how comprehensive and complete was the process of denazification of Germany herself after the defeat in the Second World War? So here we go back to the Second World War, where Stepan Bandera was they had a movement for Ukrainian independence, and at times they collaborated with Hitler. So Zahara pretty much says that Germans need to denazify themselves. But the most cynical way they're running this right now is they're literally saying that Ukraine is bombing herself. And unfortunately, people believe it. I'm just gonna turn this short video. I hope you guys will see it.
То, что у нас показывают.
Ничего не известно. Это утро началось для жителей Харькова с мощного взрыва возле областной администрации. По предварительным данным, был нанесен авиаудар. Речь идет об очередной провокации нацистских боевиков. В пригороде видны последствия ночных.
So on the right side of the screen, this is what she said. This is Belarusian TV. So they said that this is these, I think a lot of people might have seen it. It was yesterday, Russians shelled the administrative building in the heart of Kharkiv, which is being shelled like at the level of, World War II right now. And they basically said that it was the Ukrainian Nazi terrorists who bombed, who are shelling their own buildings. So they're literally saying that Ukraine is bombing herself. So the second argument is what Joe talked about, and it's about this, it's a strategic argument. It's about viewing NATO and United States as this existential threat to Russia. So basically, there's this claim that says we started this war to prevent a bigger war. There's this widely accepted, very strange claim that Russia is not starting but ending the war that NATO and Ukrainian Nazis would have waged against it if we have waited any longer. So a lot of Russians, even those who might not necessarily support Putin personally, they do think that Russia is trying to protect itself from NATO threat. They believe that NATO is going to come to their borders and like shoot Russia up, basically. The obsession with the United States and Russian propaganda, Russian TV has been just enormous, as you can see from this graph that shows mentions of Putin versus United States. So the America has been portrayed as this evil, immoral place. Okay, so one might ask, do Russians have access to other channels of information? Yes, they do. There are some independent media which are actually being blocked and banned right now. Yesterday, 2 independent media have been blocked. Radio Echo of Moscow has been blocked off the radio waves because they called the war in Ukraine a war versus special military operation. But thankfully, there are also social media, which they haven't been able to block yet. This is just a screenshot with a few of the celebrities, both Russian and Ukrainian. Actually, only one here is Ukrainian that posted against the war. And I just posted the screenshot so that you can see the follower account. And there's a question of public opinion. Who supports the war? Who doesn't? It's very difficult to understand right now. The head of the Independent Public Opinion Center, Levada, Denis Volkov, he can't provide exact figures right now, but he said that in his opinion, the pro-war majority could be more than half of the country populations. However, with each day of the war, the opinion might start changing, not in Putin's favor. Basically, people could agree with annexing the Donbass on humanitarian, reasons, what we talked about earlier, but, entering Ukraine, bombing Kiev, bombing Kharkiv, that just is shocking for people. And it's shocking to a degree that people just do not believe in this. There has been multiple cases when people post online, and I actually know some people too, who do not believe their relatives in Ukraine when they tell them that they're being shelled and attacked by Russia. Because for people, it's just an enormous shock that Russia could attack Ukraine. And for whoever is wondering, how can people believe in this? I want to ask you to consider about how effective and how widely transmitted was the message about stolen election in America in 2020. And that is despite the fact that America is a democratic country with multiple independent media. And still a lot of people did believe that the election was stolen. People may start to believe in the most absurd things if you repeat them often enough. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Anya. Our last presenter, and just to remind you, post your questions in the Q&A function. The chat has a lot of interesting discussions going on, but if you'd like your question addressed, be sure to post it in Q&A. And the links to the teaching materials are at the top of the chat and that have been reposted periodically. So our last presenter is Jenny Kaminer, who is Associate Professor of Russian and Chair of the Department of German and Russian at UC Davis. Her research focuses on contemporary Russian culture, especially youth and gender, and including literature, film, and theater. Her latest book, entitled Haunted Dreams, Fantasies of Adolescence and Post-Soviet Culture, was just published by Cornell University Press. Her presentation today is entitled Russia's Authoritarian Creep, Crackdown on Dissent in Independent Media, 2018 to the present. That looks good, Jenny, thanks.
All right, thanks very much, Jamie, for inviting me to participate today. And I wanted to begin by reminding all of those who've assembled today that Sacramento has one of the largest Ukrainian diasporic populations in North America. And I want to underscore my remarks today by reminding everyone that they are delivered in sympathy and solidarity with all of those in the UC Davis community who have familial and other ties to Ukraine. So among the barrage of images of Ukrainian cities under attack that we've seen in the past week, Western and American media has shown us footage, admittedly modest, of crowds of Russians, maybe several hundred or several thousand, gathering to protest their country's assault on Ukraine. And certainly when we contrast these with the tens or even hundreds of thousands of Europeans who have gathered in capitals like Amsterdam or Berlin over their past weekend, this is not an impressive showing. And even for those among us who perhaps don't follow developments in this part of the world very closely, or at least did not follow developments in this part of the world very closely until the past week, we may have had a general sense that Russia is an unfree society, where it is very difficult for people to express their will, either through street protest or through any other kind of political action. And my goal today is to very briefly sketch out some of the ways specifically that Russia has become more, to put it simply and admittedly reductively, more unfree in the approximately last 3 to 4 years, 4 to 5 years, and in particular in the last 12 to 18 months. And I'm certainly not suggesting that before 2017, Russia was free, and then one day they woke up to become unfree, but only that certain repressive measures and processes have begun a process of acceleration and intensification during the past few years, and in particular the past 12 to 18 months. And the laws to effectively criminalizing protest began in 2014 and have only accelerated since then. And just as it's clear that the military operation in Ukraine has been years in the conceiving and the planning, I think that we can identify a parallel operation to intensify and embed an atmosphere of fear within Russian society by the Putin government, and perhaps something even more corrosive than fear, which is apathy, cynicism, and a feeling of utter futility and helplessness. All of these, I believe, have become endemic in contemporary Russian society, and I want to sketch out very briefly why I think that is the case. So the point with which I'm going to begin are 2 waves of protests that occurred in Moscow, the first in 2017 and the second in 2019. And what was notable and remarkable about these 2 protest waves was the heavy youth presence in them. And by youth, I mean not only university-age students, like many of those who have gathered to hear the talks today, but much younger young people, 14, 15, 16 years old, high school students, and even younger. These were young people who had not participated in any remarkable numbers in previous protest waves. And there was at this time a flurry of hopeful commentary, both within, outside of Russia, and to an certain extent within Russia, about how this new internet generation that had awoken to social consciousness seemingly quite suddenly, how it was this generation that would hold the keys to the future of the survival of the Putin regime. And the crackdown on both of these waves of protests was quite severe, both the one in 2017 and the one in 2019. There were thousands of arrests, including hundreds of minors who were arrested. But beyond these arrests, what the crackdown on these protests showed is that protesting could have not only immediate short-term consequences, and I'm in no way glossing over the unpleasantness of spending time in a Russian prison, but what this crackdown also showed is that protesting could have very serious long-term consequences. So for example, there were numerous accounts of university students who were expelled for protesting. And all of that is to say that these young people were really risking not only a loss of freedom in their immediate future, but also risking harming their future prospects in very real ways. The second element that helps us to understand why Russia has become less free in the past few years is the persecution of opposition figures, and in particular, Alexei Navalny, and I know Jo mentioned him briefly in her presentation, so I won't go into too much detail, but it is worth noting that it is Navalny who is credited with galvanizing the presence of youth in political actions, with awakening the social consciousness of the young generation on a large scale. In 2017, Navalny's anti-corruption campaign produced a very smart, a very sophisticated, and a very funny video exposing the elaborate scheme for hiding the vast and obscene wealth of former President and Prime Minister Dmitry Medvedev. And this was a video that won the internet. It was viewed something like 15 million times around the time of its release. And I just checked this morning, it's been viewed somewhere upwards of 44 million times. And it's really this video which many observers credit with catalyzing the new wave of youth social and political consciousness. And I know Joe mentioned Navalny's individual fate. I think it's worth noting that Navalny had been a prominent opposition figure for a decade, even longer, when he was poisoned in August of 2020. He had faced all kinds of bureaucratic obstacles to his oppositional activities. He had been brought up on bogus charges of embezzling money, but the poisoning and then the imprisoning of Navalny certainly represent a new level of intensification of the crackdown on his oppositional activities. And alongside Navalny's individual fate, it's also worth noting that his organization has been rendered almost completely irrelevant and unable to operate within the Russian Federation. And he had established a pretty significant network of offices, grassroots organizations across the vast territory of Russia. So not only his individual imprisonment, which now looks likely to be extended upwards of 15 years, but also the fact that his organizational structure has been destroyed. The third element that I want to focus on is the crackdown and the suppression of independent media. And in 2020, the foreign agent law, which is a law that essentially means that if you accept money from any kind of foreign entity within the territory of the Russian Federation, you have to register yourself as a foreign agent. And in 2020 into 2021, this foreign agent law began to be applied to media outlets. And what that means is if you accept money from a foreign government, you have to, by law, register as a foreign agent. And these foreign funds don't necessarily have to be paid even in exchange for disseminating information, posting on social media, occasionally receiving money transfers from foreign nationals, for example, is enough to get you labeled as foreign agent media. Moreover, you can get slapped with this designation for simply distributing information from media outlets labeled foreign agents and receiving foreign income for something else. So it's a very Byzantine law. It can be applied very, very broadly. What have the effects of this been for independent media outlets? Well, first and foremost, it has led to a significant loss of advertising revenue because no one wants to do business with an entity that has been deemed a foreign agent. And second of all, every individual story, podcast, whatever you read or you listen to that has been produced by one of these independent media outlets has to be preceded by this very cumbersome text warning the reader or the listener that the content has been either produced or disseminated by an organization or an individual that has been deemed a foreign agent, and I've put the entirety of the text there. Some of the attacks on some media outlets have gone even further and beyond the foreign agent designation. So some media outlets have been labeled quote unquote undesirable organizations by the Russian Justice Ministry. And in Russia, any cooperation with an outfit rendered undesirable is a felony punishable by several years in prison. So for example, one independent outlet, Project, was forced immediately to close after receiving the undesirable organization label. The site's online archive has also had to be deleted, given that anyone citing or linking to that work, to the work of an undesirable organization, is committing a crime. And what was new in 2021 also is that the foreign agent law began to be applied not only to media outlets, but also to individual journalists. So what that means is that even if you leave journalism and you do something else entirely, you drive a cab or you become a university professor, you are still viewed as a foreign agent in the eyes of the state. So anything that you post online for the rest of your life has to be preceded by this very cumbersome 24-word disclaimer. So this foreign agent law and its expansion to include media outlets as well as individual journalists has understandably and predictably had a very chilling effect. And if you're interested in a somewhat wry take on what it is like to live with the foreign agent label in Russia. Two female journalists have put out a podcast that's entitled "Hi, You're a Foreign Agent," and kind of chronicles what it is like to live in Russia with this label attached to you. So given what I just briefly outlined about the oppression of the opposition, the crackdown of independent media outlets, where and how are Russians learning about the war? And Anya, I think, did a more nuanced and detailed job of answering that question than what I had prepared. I would just like to point out that there is an important generational component in determining who gets their news from what source. So it is, without a doubt, the older generation, the ones who survived the Soviet Union, the ones who survived the chaos of the 1990s, they are the ones who primarily are relying on these official sources of information, which brings me back to how I began these remarks by highlighting the significance of the emergence of a youth political consciousness, because I do believe that the fate of Russia will be decided by its youth. Thank you.
Thank you, Jenny. Okay, so we have about 25 minutes for questions before we wrap up at 5:30, and I want to welcome all the presenters back. I thank you all for those really sobering but very, very informative, even essential presentations. We're really grateful for your participation today. We have a lot of excellent questions, over 40 in the Q&A, so we're not going to get to all of them, and I want to apologize in advance for skipping some of those. Our staff are working very, very quickly to try to find duplicate questions and choose some questions. So again, we apologize if we don't get to yours. We did want to start with a few that were asked quite early. So we have a question from Julia Camp, and this is, I guess, is for any panelist who would like to take it. Did the previous Russian president share Putin's fear of NATO's weapons being close to Russia? And I guess you could expand this question out to kind of the 1990s in general, and kind of the 1990s attitude toward the NATO bloc, the US, and concerns that now are manifest in this war.
I'm happy to take a quick stab at that. So, so President Yeltsin was so during the very mid 1990s, he was working with NATO leaders like the American president and others, so that was Bill Clinton at the time, on a more peaceful, productive, mutually productive relationship that might potentially exist between NATO and Russia. But by 1996, 1997 or so, getting toward the end of his presidency, he was becoming more and more convinced that there really was nothing good for Russia in the expansion of NATO. In terms of whether he anticipated the deployment of weaponry right on Russia's, not Russia's border, but the border of the near abroad. So these former Soviet republics, I'm not sure that Yeltsin himself really anticipated that. And I do think that even President Putin has been taken aback by, deployments of really major defensive weaponry in Poland, Lithuania, et cetera. So I think that that has also contributed to consideration that this is this increasing threat.
Thank you. Anybody else? That spoke right to the question. Thank you, Joe. A second question, this one from Mario Arroyo. Has the US media done their due diligence in informing the public, or is it all panic? And I guess, again, here we could maybe generalize the question to how are you finding the coverage in the US media, since I assume most of our listeners are based in the US and we're reading these media. And if you have recommendations for what you think are good sources, because as we know, in these kinds of very rapidly developing circumstances, it's often hard to know where to look.
So one thing I would say off the bat there, Twitter can be a very dangerous place to go for information, but there are also some areas where you can get some really wonderful up-to-the-minute coverage from people with a lot of area studies knowledge and language skills. I put a couple of these on the resources list. Kevin Rothrock, who runs Medusa, one of these, foreign agent organizations that Professor Kaminer talked about maintains a couple of Twitter lists called Anglophone Russia and another that's specifically devoted to war reportage on the ground. And this gives a diversity of perspectives, and really it's the closest you can get to really kind of primary material, less filtered through kind of larger media sources.
Great, thank you.
And Anya's got a great suggestion in the chat as well. Kyiv Independent is fantastic.
Medusa has an English language site.
Yeah.
Have you found any trends in the U.S. coverage, or have you found it pretty even-handed? And it's a pretty
I think the
expansive
situation is so unambiguous, and
Yeah.
there's just so little gray area that, and the media coverage, I think, has been, I don't think it calls for balance. I think the situation is just so unambiguously horrific that the media coverage has captured that well. I will say I read a very informative and insightful piece in Politico. It's an interview with Fiona Hill, who is a national security advisor, had her moment of fame and infamy during the administration of Trump. And she had, I think, a very, very informed perspective on the situation that I would recommend.
Yeah, I would say, if anything, I've been a little surprised, given what Professor Kaminer says, that the situation is quite unambiguous. I've been surprised in some media about the kind of waffling and whataboutism that's come from certain corners of the coverage. But I think in the main, the coverage has been strong.
Great. Thank you. Anybody else before we move on? Okay, question from John Dawson. What is the role of the philosophy of Dugin in these developments, or the ambitions of Putin's Russia? Is the Nazbol ideology actually a persistent ideology, or is it fringe? How is this comparable to the right sector of Ukraine? And maybe related, there's a question farther down in the Q&A about just kind of right-wing groups like Azov used as Russian state media as a justification. So.
Well, one thing to say off the bat is that Dugin was actually quite disappointed about Putin's actions in the Donbass. It was not what he and other nationalists were hoping for, and he's gone on record saying this, that they were anticipating the creation of Novorossiya and wanted Putin to really kind of give these local nationalists their head instead of attempting to control them, or using them as kind of pawns in some larger geostrategic kind of game.
Could you maybe review who Dugin is and sort of his importance in political movements and politics in Russia?
It's a relatively marginal political thinker whose idea is that Russia should restore itself as this Eurasian power, and some of his ideas did translate to Putin's idea of this Russian world, which is what he is intended to do with this war. His big idea is to create the Russian world, which will include Russia, Belarus, and Ukraine. I'm sorry, Russia, Belarus, and Ukraine. And they will all be friends together, and they will oppose the West. And there will be a third, there will be China, then there's going to be Russian world, and then there's going to be the West. So it definitely, he is pretty marginal. I don't know anyone who would read him now, but he definitely was influential at some point, and I'm sure he still is influential in certain groups, but it's majority of people probably don't even know him.
Okay, thank you. Next question from Yakov Perlov. What is the relationship between Russia and Belarus? This is, I guess, a rumor that that there was a subway bombing. But so this questioner is wondering why the two countries would be allied right now. And I guess Belarus actually is becoming militarily involved. So I'm sure people are hearing about this relationship between Russia and Belarus. And so maybe some general context, and then maybe a few more specifics if possible about where we are now in terms of that partnership.
Muted, so sorry. So Lukashenko, the president of Belarus, has actually attempted for quite a long time now to sort of fall somewhere between, to keep Europe happy and to keep Russia happy, to have alliances with each, to have some opportunities for deeper economic integration with Europe, but also to maintain their close relationship with Russia. Interestingly, the economy of Belarus has benefited much more vis-a-vis its relationship with Russia than Ukraine's economy, even though there's important gas pipelines that run across both of those two countries. However, the really, I think, key moment came a few months ago when there was a very serious, there have been uprisings against Lukashenko in the past, but a more serious uprising. And then Lukashenko asked Putin to bring Russian military to their aid. And so since then, the relationship between the two has been changed really dramatically on the world stage. I would be very interesting to know what Lukashenko was thinking about what he got when he asked Russia to intervene. It's similar in some ways to the Russian intervention in Kazakhstan. So now they have a much closer relationship than they had before. And it's very worrisome.
I think,
of course, Lukashenko also, I mean, he's a dictator, and he rigged the last election, and there were massive protests, which he put down. So this is exactly to Putin's liking. He would have liked that to happen in Ukraine in 2014. So he's very similar. I mean, this is sort of the pattern that Putin wants these kind of lackeys in charge of countries, to his west.
Yep. Okay. Anybody else? Should we move on? Question: major wars seem to have the habit of changing the status quo. How might this war change the post-World War II international system? And is it possible that we're moving into a new era, a post-World War II, or a post-Cold War era?
Well, maybe I'll start on that. I mean, my remarks were intended to suggest that, yes, we are in an entirely new world. I don't think Putin anticipated that his actions would actually bring together most of the world against him. His assumption was that NATO was not going to be able to respond in any kind of unified way. The United States was, Biden is weak. American politics are fractured. So his calculation was they could get away with this. And he's been disappointed on two fronts. First of all, the Ukrainians have actually resisted very strongly. And secondly, the reaction in the world is really quite remarkable. I mean, the fact that they've imposed, most significantly, the sanctions on the central bank, so that all of the foreign currency that the Russians have built up over the last 8 years is essentially frozen. This is something that's never happened before to a major country. I think they did it to Iran, but so I think we are in an entirely new world. We don't know where it's going. We don't know, as I indicated, it could go very badly because it looks like Putin is, he's a gambler, and he lost the first bet. And what gamblers usually do is they double down. So I'm anticipating he's going to double down both in Ukraine and in relationship to the West.
Yeah, and I think it's also worth mentioning, of course, the relationship to China here in terms of a post-World War II relationship, and that's really one that's just unfolding. I don't think we know a lot about it, but obviously there are international geopolitical implications, including around Taiwan and China's relationship to Taiwan. It's traditional aggression towards Taiwan. So, actually, I guess a related question came in about the sanctions that are being imposed, since David raised those. The question includes the freezing of the central bank accounts. This will drastically reduce the volumes of international trade with Russia, including food and consumer imports to Russia. How will the economic damage of the sanctions affect the Putin regime and war effort?
Well, I
It's
think
really-
the
Go ahead.
major question has to do with, they exempted energy transactions. And since energy transactions are an enormous part of Russia's trade with the rest of the world, the question still remains whether, this particular type of sanction is going to have an enormous effect. It will obviously affect ordinary Russian people. They can't get an iPhone, for example. And the like. But the question is, what is it going to do to the political elite? Is it going to cause them to change their minds? I mean, maybe if they lose their yachts and their mansions in Kensington in London, that'll have an effect on them. But we don't actually know yet.
Yeah, I think there are a couple things. I mean, there are a few things to say about this. One, I don't think we have an example of regime change happening because of sanctions. I would be happy to be wrong about this. I'm not sure that there is a precedent for that. With that being said, this set of sanctions is going to cause a lot of pain, both for ordinary people in Russia, and some of them are quite specifically, as Professor Biale has said, directed against oligarchs. And that might imply some kind of regime change. It's hard to know. I think the other thing I would want to say about this is that sanctions which are this wide-ranging and this comprehensive may have some long tail effects that it will be difficult to know how they play out. One thing that, so I specialize in Central Asia, and so just one thing as an example, in response to the sanctions, the Russian government has had put a ban on sending currency out of the country. Well, several countries in the region, Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan both get about 30% of their gross domestic product from remittances from workers, the vast majority of them in Russia. Georgia and Armenia, also Uzbekistan, all over 10%, the majority of them from Russia. So this could have devastating effects on other Eurasian economies, and the political implications of that are very difficult to game out right now.
I would just quickly add that we don't really know what the effect is going to be on public opinion. It could galvanize support for the regime. We don't know. So I think that what scholarship in political science, which has done a great deal of work in the last 2 decades on why authoritarian regimes collapse, focuses on elites. And so I think it's going to be really interesting to see how this affects elites and how they respond, and then the role of the security service, the multiple security services in Russia, which are very powerful. I think that the elites, we need to think about other elites besides just the oligarchs, the military elite and the security elite as well. And it'll be that's what I think we all need to be watching carefully.
There was a report in the Washington Post today, and I don't know if it's true or some kind of spin, that a Chechen special forces unit was ordered to go into Kiev and kill Zelensky, and that the Ukrainians were tipped off by someone in the FSB, in other words, the successor to the KGB. Now, if that's true, that's very significant. It means there are people in the military security establishment in Russia which would like to see Putin fail.
Let me just add something really interesting, Professor Biale. That was a really interesting comment. So Yeltsin, recall that in the time of the coup, Yeltsin's dacha was encircled by the KGB, and yet they didn't move forward in time to arrest Yeltsin and his entourage. They waited until after he had left for Moscow. And so that decision echoes, I think, that point. That's a really interesting point. And then so that was regime change. That was a regime change. And in some ways, the security forces played an important role.
Okay, I want to add about the sanctions and the oligarchs and the elites. There has been a question like, is it true that oligarchs do not support Putin. Yes, it's true. They are all terrified. They're all getting, there is like literally a Wikipedia list of Russian oligarchs, and the European Union, it seems like they use that list, they go down the list and they sanction each and every one of them. My good friend works for one of the smaller oligarch, who is actually a citizen of 2 other countries. And he's not involved in the state affairs since either late 90s or early 2000s, but he right now is terrified. He is they're all absolutely against this. They consider it's a suicidal mission. And moreover, it is pretty much a fact that his own ministers did not know that the war was going to start, that he was going to start this war, except of course for his military ministers. And in regards to the coup, the problem is he's literally in the bunker. And when he meets even with his generals, I'm sure everyone saw the picture where he's on one side of the large table and on the other side are Shoigu and Gerasimov, 2 his main military guys. Well, people assume that he's very scared of COVID, but is he also scared of, like, he's, there has been a lot of conversation actually in the United States about his mental state, and it seems like he's quite literally is going like bonkers. So to physically kind of get rid of him, I'm not sure how easy it would be to reach him in that bunker, but that's all speculation. But what we know is that oligarchs are most certainly very much against this war, and all of the government all the ministers are also against this war, because he's destroying what Elvira Nabiullina built. Even, Russian Post actually sent me a very sent message. It was not against it wasn't against the Putin, but it was like pro-peace pretty much. And they're like, we're so sad, we can't operate, so it's like the public opinion is very controversial right now.
Okay, thank you. We're down to about the last 5 minutes, so I'm going to combine a couple of questions here about U.S. Politics and U.S. policy. Question from a teacher, so I think this could be helpful to hear about from our experts. I have many students claiming this invasion would never have happened under Trump. I'm curious what your responses would be. And someone else asked, to follow up on this comment, how did the panelists respond to some saying that Trump's second term would not have seen this invasion? If they agree, is it because of supposed prowess of Trump, or more his overall disposition toward Putin as more of an ally?
It's a counterfactual,
Yeah.
right? We don't know, but the fact is that it's, I think Putin regarded Trump as I said in my remarks, a useful idiot. And if he decided to invade with Trump, he would have been even more confident of success, because Trump was simply not capable, just as he showed in response to COVID, not capable of rising to any kind of crisis.
Ian?
Yeah, I would say 2 things. One, I would generally encourage, I would generally discourage explanations of Putin's actions right now that have much to do with what the US does or doesn't do. The US is not the only player on the chessboard. I think that certainly Putin would have, wanted to act aggressively towards Ukraine, regardless of who was the American president. And certainly what I think can be said, given Trump's antagonism, useless antagonism towards NATO and towards the EU that we saw, it's very, very hard to imagine the kind of coordinated response to the invasion that we've seen without with Trump in office. But I think that it does not seem to me that American deterrent policy or American kind of making nice, even to the extent that NATO expansion played a role in this was something which was, that those grievances are 20 years old. at this point.
So, and in a related question is, what in your perspectives are the needed and most effective U.S. policies for eliminating the military, political, and humanitarian threats to Ukraine? So kind of what should the U.S. do now in this very difficult situation? I know it's a hard question, obviously.
I mean, I think one question is when it comes to military assistance, can the U.S. and NATO get arms in there? I mean, there's going to be a point where they won't be able to. And the question is, how quickly can they get them in? And how well can the Ukrainians use them? And I think it's quite interesting. There's this 40-mile or 40-kilometer long convoy that's been sitting there, that's been on our television screens for 2 days. Everybody knows it's there, and it's not clear that the Ukrainians have the capacity to attack it. So, I mean, my guess is that if we continue military support to Ukraine, we'll probably do it also covertly. I think the CIA will be in there instructing the Ukrainians. I'm guessing that'll be an escalation.
I would like to see as much assistance as possible to Ukrainians who are trying to escape this dangerous situation. I would like to see as much support as we can give to organizations in Russian civil society that are very bravely and at great personal and professional risk speaking out against the war. I would like to see as much support as we can possibly give to groups like that, and an absolutely merciless attitude towards Russian capital.
And I would also add that what we should not do is isolate Russian students, Russian academics, Russian cultural producers, those who actively seek ties with us. I think the wrong approach would be to paint all of Russia and Russians and its entire cultural heritage with the broad brush of Putin. I think it behooves us all to remember that Russia is not Putin and Putin is not Russia.
Okay, thank you. And then maybe a last question, because we're a little bit past time already. A question from Jeremy Eklund. A question from a student of mine: is there something we can do to help Ukraine and its people? And I do think Ian answered this partially in the Q&A with a link. I'll put it in again. But if anyone wants to talk about supporting the Ukrainian people or nation, it'd be great if you did so now to conclude our presentation. So there is that. I'm trying to get the link to paste over. Ian, helpfully, do you still have it, Ian? Maybe you could post it.
I should. Let me try.
And I should say also, we'll post these various resources.
It's in the chat now.
Thank you. We'll post these various resources on the webpage that the Davis Humanities Institute created for this event. So, okay, well, I want to thank our presenters for those really informative presentations, sobering as they may have been, and for being here today and these great answers to questions. I want to thank everyone who attended. We had a huge number of attendees. I don't know that you could see, but we had hundreds of attendees today. So thank you for stopping by. We're really inspired by your concern on this important topic. So stay safe, everybody, and thanks again. Take care.